Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation with editor Julia Bloch, who cut His House. His House is a horror movie that focuses on the story of two South Sudanese refugees who escaped South Sudan to the UK. And it is a social commentary, but also a terrifying horror movie at its core, and takes a really interesting look at the sort of haunted house and ghost movie genre. It's directed by Remy Weeks, and Remy won a BAFTA in 2021 for Outstanding Debut by a British director, writer, producer. This is his first feature, which is phenomenal. And we are going to unpack Julia's process of editing the film and talk about what makes it so incredible. So there will be some spoilers towards the end, but we'll talk kind of like around things to begin with, and then I'll give a little sort of warning, or we'll flag when it goes into that. But Julia, welcome to Edit Girls. Thank you so much. So tell me a little bit about how you first came across this project. Like, how did you get involved in editing His House?
Well, this was one of the ones that really just came to me through my agent. Really wasn't, it wasn't on my radar at all. And in fact, I had sort of told my agent, I don't want to do any more horror movies for a while, because I had just kind of done a couple of them in a row. Or horror genre, that's a conversation to be had. How we define those two different things. But I've started getting a lot, like after Green Room, I started getting a lot of scripts that were like, just horror, just all kinds of different horror films. And some of them were really good, but I just was worried about getting, pigeonholed into that and wanted to do something else. So when Mira, my agent, came to me and was like, well, it's a horror film, I was like, okay, I'll read it, but you know how I feel about this. And then I read it, and honestly, it wasn't what I was expecting at all. I mean, it was just this at times really beautiful, strange, kind of creative way to look at, or to even think of using horror for this type of story was appealing to me. And then, so then I met with Remy over Zoom, because I was in New York and he was in London. And he also wasn't really what I was expecting. I mean, I didn't know him at all, but he just was so bright, and had this like, he was almost like laughing about something. He just had this energy to him, and it was really he was very excited about like the visual effects and about telling the story in a very specific way. He got me excited for the project because I really loved talking to him. And and then I saw a short that he had done called Tickle Monster, which is it's a very short, but it's really good. And it just kind of also set a little bit of a tone for what his style is. And I knew that he had come from a background of commercials and more art-driven stuff. And so all that together kind of made me think, well, maybe it's not going to be like just a horror film. There's going to be this up. And then, of course, the subject matter. I should have started with that. But the way that, Remy was going to present this story seemed to me like that would be something new and different. And also I was going to get to go to London for many months to work on it, and that was exciting too. So
How important is that director chemistry for you? Making sure that you're aligned, and because you're going to be in the trenches together in terms of cutting the film. What is that
yeah,
first impression? How important is that?
that's a really good question. I think the first impression is important, although as we've all learned through life, like sometimes it's not. There's more to it than the first impression. So what I've learned, I mean, in general, over the years, I've sort of tried to adapt my interview style. Like in that first meeting, I am looking a lot for like just sort of how easy is it to communicate? What are someone's, even things like how much eye contact do they use? Like how
Mm.
what's so different when it's over Zoom, you know, when you're meeting in person, it's
Yeah.
easier to get a sense of someone's body language and all that. But I mean, I used to go in really like having read the script, you know, at least twice, and I come and I have like an angle on the script itself, and I kind of lead with, you know, things I like, things that I would look out for. And I don't know. I think that I mean I still, of course, will talk about the script, but I used to be very focused on kind of presenting like myself as someone who's intelligent and someone who's articulate and someone who you know you can hang out with and all of that
Mm.
stuff. But I wasn't as much focused on what the other person was bringing to the conversation.
Mm.
And now, having had, you know, I've had a full range of experience. I've had some great director relationships. I've had some that didn't work out so well. Um, I'm starting to try to ask more specific questions in those initial interviews to get a sense of the person a little bit
Mm.
like behind you know, behind how they want to present themselves and more emotional intelligence kind of questions or try to bring that aspect of myself out to you know, I had to learn that the hard way, but I
I was
think
going to
it's
say,
really,
what kind of questions what
um,
kind of questions do you
it sort
ask?
of depends. Like I might just start by saying something about, you know, a book that I'm reading or, you know,
Mm.
something that I picked up on in the news recently, almost as an offhand and like sort of see how are they going to be like, oh, that's interesting, but, you know, let's get down to business. Or are they going to, you know, kind of bring something human to the, you know,
Mm.
because, you know, so much is that I think for me, I would start with the material. Like if I don't have something to say about the script, I'm not going to take a meeting in the first place because that is the basis of the work you're going to be doing together.
Mm.
But things about like, I mean, it's hard to ask someone directly, like, how do you respond to feedback? Because, you know, they're
Mm.
not necessarily going to answer honestly,
You're
or
like,
they
oh,
might
I'm
not
really
even,
great. I'm really
yeah,
relaxed. You know,
I know.
just throw it at
Everybody's
me. And
collaborative. Everybody like values communication, but then when you get
mm.
down to it, sometimes you realize that like you know people have different definitions of collaboration.
Mm.
So I think it is, yeah, and that's just increasingly important to me as I, you know, have edited more films and have had different experiences. Like I really want to be able to have functional,
Mm.
rewarding relationships with the directors that I work with. And that is, I mean, I think any editor will tell you this. And honestly, I don't know what like a DP would say or a production designer. Maybe it's the same for them. But I would say, you know, a majority of the work that we're doing is emotional work. It's
Mm.
psychological, it's hand holding, it's, you know, trying to create an atmosphere of trust and all of that stuff, which is so important. And those are skills that you can work on as well as your editing skills. But so sometimes, you know, in certain situations, I find it can take up too much time because, you know, but I think that's just something that you also kind of, it depends on the dynamic, like any relationship, you know, sometimes it's easier than others.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think that, like you said, people can say they're collaborative, people can say that they would do things in a certain way, but the reality is like there are going to be tough moments and big decisions to make when you're cutting something about what to keep, what to lose, how to, you know, and yeah, you want to feel that you can have those conversations and do the best by the project.
Yeah.
So with his house then, so okay, so you didn't want to do another horror, but this is it's unlike anything I've ever seen, and I'm a huge horror fan, and I feel like it just does something so unique because it still gives horror fans what they want. Or again, obviously that's quite a generalized statement, but it has this sort of, you know, yeah, this really important message throughout. So how did you balance those two things whilst cutting the film? Obviously, the drama side, and then those really scary horror genre moments.
Yeah. Um, I mean, you know, there was a lot of it was written there in the script in the sense
Hmm.
that, you know, something I think Remy was really conscious of wanting uh, to show in kind of the horror of real life, and then the horror of specifically this a refugee situation. So he really used some of the daily aspects of what they had to deal with as kind of the basis for the horror. So I think that, and in the past that they'd been through, in terms of some of the imagery, like the water stuff, the going back to the drowning in the boat and all of these things. It's like, and the doll, that became a thing too, which dolls can immediately be really creepy,
Dolls
and
are
so
always creepy.
yeah. So I think, some of that was, thought and planned ahead and designed for, and then other things do come, I think, in the editing, and when you're talking about balance in terms of like, what's propelling the action, what's in, and seeing a progression in these characters from when they first arrive in this house to like actually not that long after. It's really over a matter of days that the whole story kind of unfolds. Um, but yeah, I think that the fact that there was this very human drama, family, tragedy at the heart, I mean, it's political in the sense that it is, they're fleeing their country, but it doesn't go into the details necessarily of like what was happening there, and um, it doesn't go into like a lot of detail on social housing in the UK and all of that, but like you're in a council estate, you're dealing with a social worker. That's Matt Smith's character, um,
Mm.
and so those things are just kind of presented in a way that are very and honestly, like that's the stuff that I was most drawn to, that I really, in the script and in terms of editing, I had the most fun cutting the more kind of not overtly horror stuff. But I sometimes think that when you have that, it does lend it, like it is somehow, it just like it does increase the stakes, and so therefore I think it kind of does drive the horror a little bit, where you're not only kind of waiting tensely to see what's about to pop out from the dark, but you're also trying to think like, what's the deal with these people? Like, what have they been through, and how are they going to overcome this situation?
I think the ambiguity, like you said, there's not too much detail. You don't really know what's happened. It's quite, maybe symbolic isn't quite the right word, but they are sort of representations of a situation rather than this is specifically what happened, especially in the council estate. Like you don't really know where they are, like it's all quite ambiguous, and you get a real sense of how lost they feel, certainly with, I guess, Rial, and Bol is trying really hard to assimilate and be as British as he can be, in the situation. But you definitely get that feeling of Rial feeling really lost. There's one scene where she gets lost, like within the maze of the council estate, and I'm trying to. I think I did listen to an interview with Remy saying that there was a definite reference to the scene in The Shining at the end in the maze. Is that the case, or is that a reference that you
I
kind
mean,
of?
if he says it, then there
Yeah,
is.
then it must be. Yeah.
Actually, I don't remember talking to him about that,
Uh-huh.
but that was really a fun one to cut, because in some ways, let's an example, like it's not, there's nothing's jumping out at you. It's more of a creepy kind of like feeling. And we did use some intentional, the same shot, but kind of flip it. So you're like, it feels almost like she's walked around that corner before, but it's slightly different. But it's actually, I think we did that once or twice in the sequence on purpose to make it feel kind of uncanny. But then some stuff, of course, like he put in there the kid kicking the ball against the wall and who then shows up a second time. And these are things that are just like, and I just noticed it. I was rewatching it before, because this was like in 2018 we were working on this, so it's been a while. But I did rewatch it because I knew we were going to talk about it. and in that sequence, there's one shot where Rial's walking away from camera, and a young kid is walking towards the camera, pushing an empty stroller, and it's just
Mm.
kind of on the side. But I saw that tonight, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that was that's just the kind of thing, the kind of detail that is, there's a story about a child and a missing child, but and then there's actually an empty stroller that shows up later in another scene. And so is I don't know if other people catch that, and that's not necessarily something that anyone would remember or even think about that much. But I think even on a subliminal level, it does affect you, where there's these things that you're kind of like, that's not quite right, and then that's one layer. And then you have the real drama of, which you find only at the end, like kind of what actually happened. And then that's another layer. And then of course, and there's humor in it also. And then you have kind of on top of that, the more overt horror stuff, like the jump scares and the kind of um, the things that I think drive that aspect of the story. Um, but hopefully it all does it all feels like it's working together.
Mhm. I
That's
think there's a cohesion that could have gone potentially wrong. Like there's a lots of different, sometimes you'll watch a film and you'll be like, tonally, what are they trying to, how am I supposed to feel? I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. Whereas with his house, the balance is really there. I mean, again, if we go into kind of spoiler territory, you're looking at it almost, the visual effects towards the end, and the witch, the monster, the kind of creature that's ultimately haunting them, like that could have missed the mark, in a way it could have been too much, and actually it was, yeah, played really perfectly. So can you talk a bit about maybe within the edit, the visual effects side? So how did you work with the visual effects? What was there when you were cutting? What wasn't there? Maybe give us a bit of a sense of all of that.
Yeah, that was, I mean, Remy's really into VFX, and he has done a lot with it, or had even before this on um, his own, independent work. And so he was very interested in like, does some of this, I mean, the creature at the end was practical. Like that was actually
Yeah,
an
I've seen
actor.
that. Anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah,
really
really cool.
head to toe, makeup and everything. And there were other practical things like that I think also helped to sell. There's some things that are totally CGI, there's some things that are mixed, and then everything in between. Um, but I mean, it was a range from everything from, like, there was a tank, and we like some of the boat and the water stuff, and then there's that one shot which starts in their kitchen, and then the camera pulls back, and then your introduction into that whole sequence. I mean, that was green screen, some of that stuff is like kind of actually, not necessarily a revolutionary technique, but then it has to be executed really well. And so, and then the things that come out of the dark, that was also VFX. So to answer your question, there was not a lot while they were shooting, and I went to London to be there for the shoot, and then also most of post was in London. So what was great about that is they were shooting in West London Studios,
Mhm.
and I think that's what it's called. But I was there with my assistant editor they kind of created a room for us near the production office. So we were there, and they were shooting on a stage in the same place, and everyone would break for lunch. And so we would go down, and sometimes I would have lunch with like the camera department, or, so that was kind of fun as an aside. But for the VFX, you could really, there was a lot of conversation about it, and like Remy could come up and look at things that I was doing and go, so we checked in during the day sometimes. I mean, it was really busy for him, of course, but like we were able to do, or the line producer or somebody could come in at their break and just see if it was working and all that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, there was a whole separate section of this film that was a little bit unusual, or maybe not that unusual, but it was for me. Um, where we tested it at one point, kind of later in the process, and then it was a American studio as well as BBC and all these other entities. So there was an aspect of kind of a bit of a British American sensibility, um,
Hmm.
and or I mean, or a sort of a more arty and commercial. And I think everybody wants those, wants both of those worlds. Like we want to make a film that has an arty sensibility, but also can appeal to and work on a bigger commercial level. Um, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think in this case, we tested the film at one point and decided that it needed more, like bigger scares than what we actually had. So they did do some additional photography. And a lot of the what I would call jump scares, especially at the beginning of the film, were actually additional photography.
Oh, that's
And through that process, some of the VFX developed as well, like or not just VFX, but just like the look of like the mask that the girl wears at one point, and that stuff kind of came along later in the process, which is always really interesting to see, and you don't always get the opportunity to have some of the like changes like that happen progressively, and but when you have the resources to do it, it's really it is, I think, great because you are able to work with what you have, take a moment, step back and see. Because I think of the film like this. I mean, listen, there's a version of me, if not that anyone's asking, like if it was your film, as an editor, you can't ever really answer that, because it's not ever your film. But I think, there's a version that I think you could have told that story in a much more socio-realist way. But
hmm
it might, and I mean, it could have been a beautiful film, and it just might not have reached as many people, or it might have been too predictable. And I think part of the reason that Remy wanted to, not to speak for him, but from our conversations, I think to tell a story like this with using fantasy visual effects, and because it's not just to get like gore, and there's a lot of invented stuff in there, and it's from like their deep imagination or like their own memories of these things that have become twisted. Um, I think it's really creative, and I think that it's a very effective way. I mean, I guess I'm giving this long answer because I'm remembering how it felt in the moment when you're
hmm
sitting there, and I was like, I'm just like, is this too much? Like, honestly, part of me, I think, resists some of the um, more kind of conventional scares, but like you said in the beginning, you there's this idea of giving, you want to give people what they want, and like there are certain horror fans like you expect, and you want to deliver, but also to do justice to something that you also want people to like. I mean, when you get to that stuff at the end, like I still tear up when I see it, and
hmm
there aren't a lot of horror films that elicit a deep emotional response. I mean, there certainly are some, and I'm blanking on them now, but like I think it's maybe more the exception than the rule. So trying to accomplish all that, I think there's some level of like the psychological nature of the scares helps because it gets you, it's still character information, you're still getting, it's not just some, something from outside of the world that comes hurtling through the window. It's something from the story itself that's been kind of twisted. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
no, I completely, I think that's so interesting so there's the scare, which is essentially like the first real, aha, this is a horror movie moment when the girl Naya is behind him, and it's like really scary, and it's like, yeah, then the bird comes out of the wall, doesn't it? And it's a jump scare, but it's also a very haunting moment because of the nature of what you know they've been through. I think it really, horror always, and which is part of the reason why I love horror, is because it's, you look back in sort of history of film, and they tend to be movies that are very of the fears of the time, that say quite a lot, so about the sort of social economic, or whatever it may be, like, situation of the time in which they are created. And I think that this one, if you're going to look at everything in the world and sort of thing, it's so perfectly reflective of the horrors of what is happening in the world at the moment. And I think that to tap into a horror audience and give them what they want, but also be something, don't get me wrong, there are people that I know that wouldn't want to watch it because of the horror aspects, because it's too
Yeah.
much, but the story itself, they would be, interested in it. It's almost like a gateway to those two sides, where you've got horror fans who might be like, oh, I'm going to be a bit more interested in the, the drama side of this, and then vice versa. And I think
Yeah.
it's done really, really well.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of the sort of the fantasy, you mentioned about the fantasy side, and we go in between, dreams and or visions rather, and the reality of what they're going through. Tell us a little bit about how you structure those moments and get the pacing right. One minute they're, he's in the house, and then the next minute he's somewhere else. How do you look at that, and how do you ensure that that feels right?
Um, so I think again, a lot of that was planned for, and some of the really like important transitions were done, practically some with some enhancement. But like the one where um, towards the end when Rial like tries to escape the house and she
Hmm.
goes through the window, for example. I mean, if you when you look at it's that's like the simplest. There's no VFX there really. I mean, but it has that cool effect because it's just it's literally she goes from you're inside the house, she goes through out the window, then you cut to the exterior of the house, and they've painted it the same color. There's this gray color, but then as the camera pans away and she's calling out the window, you reveal that you're in Africa, and you're in it's completely different. Look, everything's she's in this totally different location. So, and that is just a cut from two different locations that is, joined, but it's very effective. Um, and then I think some other ones, I mean, I think one of the things that we tried to do in terms of the fantasy stuff was, um, the way that each character experiences what's going on in the house is different. And it also tells a story within the story of their marriage and their ability to communicate, and how they're each approaching this um, tremendous experience that they're going through. And it's very. I mean, Remy talked a lot about the concept of the good immigrant, in this idea that Bull kind of exemplifies. If we just smile a lot and do what's expected of us, we'll be like the good ones. Um, and then I think that is in Rial's kind of more like, well, let's just remember that we're not
Who we
necessarily the ones that are creating the problems. And then that mirrors in there every time he keeps finding these scary things are happening and these gross things are happening, and yet at the same time, so his when he goes in and out of the world, it's a little creepier, it's darker, it's more ominous. She has there's like one time where she opens the closet door and then she's sees the image of, and it's like almost poignant, and she doesn't get scared, it affects her. And then even later in the film, those creatures that have come out and kind of terrorized him when he's the lights are going off and on, they're still there, but they're behind the wall and she's seeing them. So, I think that was very important too. I mean, I struggled with it a little bit, to be honest, because I kept thinking to myself, she's not scared. This woman And she says at some point, she's like, "Are you kidding me? Like after what we've been through, you think I'm going to be afraid of the dark? Like get over it." Which I love that about her character.
Yeah.
But there's that, but at the same time, it's a reality that if you have a character who's not afraid, then the audience also will not be afraid. That's so many times I think you can make absolutely anything scary if you show someone being scared of it. And I think, like, I mean, David Lynch obviously is a master of that, but like, that whole like famous Mulholland Drive sequence where he's like in the parking lot and just like
Yeah,
approaching.
oh my gosh.
I get ill just thinking about it. It's so like
I
tense.
saw a photo the other day of him with the woman who plays that
Yeah,
character. Like,
I know.
oh, it's just like that's haunted me. Um, yeah, for context, anyone who doesn't know Mulholland Drive and that scene, it is very much just it's just shots of people's faces and then just moving around the back of a parking lot.
But
But it
he's
is
terrified. He is so,
terrifying.
so,
Yeah.
so frightened. And we have no idea of what, but we're just
Mm,
like, like this. And so, which I think to some extent is, Bull is, he's afraid of the dark in some ways, which of course represents psychologically as well, like the things he's keeping, his shadow, the things he's not facing himself. And Rial doesn't have, she, at least, which is part of the structure of the film, you believe that she's more clear-eyed and she's accepting what has actually happened. And then of course there's another twist at the end. But
mm,
that's the stuff that I think that I'm most interested in personally in a story like that. And then to me it's like the horror becomes a way to tell the story, but it's not the
mm,
story that you're telling. You're telling the story of these people, and you want to find the way to dramatize and kind of you know symbolically express the and of course make people watch your movie and keep
mm.
the people entertained. So trying to do all of that is a tall order, let alone on your first film. So
Yeah.
that's a lot. um yeah.
So let's talk then so that we can get specific. Anyone who
Yeah.
hasn't seen the film, and if we've been like tap dancing around things, that we'll start to sort of spoil it. The the structure is quite like neat in a way. You see something you believe to be true in that Bol and Rial have their daughter with them. They escape. The daughter drowns, and then their journey of being in that house starts to unravel. And I remember feeling, why isn't he as upset as he should be? I just felt like
Yeah.
in both of them, like it felt really something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know. And then obviously towards as the end unravels, we discover that it wasn't their daughter, and Bol, took this child from her mother, and that guilt is what we see manifest and become real in his visions and his, like you said, he has much more nightmarish things. And then you see the unraveling at the end where Rial is complicit, but she's not doing the action of taking the child. And I suppose perhaps that is, her, she's more at peace. Like they were very desperate. It brings up all these conversations and ideas around what do you do when your own life is at risk? So with all of that in mind, looking at when we start to realize what really happened at the end, can you talk a bit about the unraveling, like the moments, were there like key points of like realization moments at the end that you needed to hit?
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean in terms of the unraveling of that story to work out what really happened?
I mean, yeah, there's two things that come to mind. One is originally, so as a film is now, as it is,
Mhm.
it starts with just a few shots of the family, kind of on their journey. They're trekking through like this dusty desert type environment. And you see him, he's holding this little girl, and then they're on a truck, and then they're on a boat. It's a little bit like impressionistic, and it's kind
Mhm.
of just presented without any explanation. And then just as you get the sense something bad is about to happen when they're on this boat, and then he wakes up and they're in an asylum kind of detention center, and then so you don't know, is that a dream or is that you don't really know exactly. And even the idea that they have a daughter is kind of just parsed out little by little. Um, and then it becomes a bigger part of the story, and you think you're starting to piece it together. Um, but originally, the way it was scripted and the way it was shot, we didn't have that in the beginning. There was a different sequence that was still, it was still a dream. It was a dream, but it was more like an actual dream sequence where he was kind of in this water and hearing things, and like it was more, um, I don't know what to say, what it was more of.
Surreal and dreamlike,
Real,
I guess.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was certainly not an image that we were going to ever see anywhere else in the film. It was like this dream. It was more of the quality that of that scene I mentioned earlier, where when he's in the water and he starts to see
Mm.
those other bodies. It was kind of in that same visual world.
Yeah.
Um, so it was going to be like a bad dream that he then wakes up from. Um, and at some point, we had the conversation. There's so many people. There's producers. There's other. We do feedback screenings, friends and family. So I don't remember exactly like whose idea some of these things were, but it was part of the process at some point that maybe we should put some of the footage up front to even if it wasn't fully explained, it was kind of like it gave you the sense that there was more to this story, and you saw this girl's face, and you really got at least a quick glimpse of them as a family unit. And then
Mhm.
when we cut later in the film to this flashback stuff, you recognize it, so you're a little, it's not, somehow it helped to tie that together. um, but then the other thing, which is a very small thing, but this was, we had a consulting editor come on at one point to just take a look at it, and
Mhm.
um, he was actually the one thing I mean, I'm sure he helped us in lots of ways, but like the one thing I remember, because it was so small, but it really
Mhm.
made a big difference, was in that sequence when we cut to Sudan, and you're in the world of where she's with her friends and they're singing and embracing each other, and you think like, it's actually a moment, it's a beautiful moment, and of you think, God, finally she at least gets some comfort, and community. And there's a moment where, like, yeah, the sort of elder woman figure in that group um, says to her, she asks, Rial asks about her daughter, and the woman says, who? Like,
Mm.
what daughter? And originally, that little exchange between them then kicked off the whole bigger sequence where, Rial is with all of the tragedy that, you see in the classroom and everything after that. Um, so what this editor did was just take that moment out, trying to remember this correctly as I remember it. He took that out and put it later. So essentially, it's the same transition where she comes out of the window, she run and she's like, "Where am I?" Her friends embrace her and sing, and there's this big moment, and as it is in the film, as it ended up, um, there's a moment where she's like, she then goes into the I'm really explaining this badly, but she goes
Okay.
into um the memory of what happened, and then when she comes out of it, she says, "What happened to my daughter?" And then the woman
Mm.
says, "Who? Like, you don't have a daughter." So somehow that just elevated it, because we've seen what some people might, already know what the circumstances were or are, in South Sudan, and these rival gangs and tribes and the killing and the real massacre of people, and trying to imagine that, but it is somewhat realistic, and but then on top of that, back to the story of these people, and to a very personal experience of these characters, then it's the question, this whole time you've thought this woman has lost her daughter. Now it's a question, is that her daughter at all? And, then you go to that part. So that just, instead of the whole thing being kind of this level of emotion, we got this level of emotion, and then it kind of upped it for that. I thought, just, I don't know if that's clear at all, but like,
No,
just,
no, it is clear. It's kind of like really reminding you of that moment of her losing her child, which you feel is just, the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then, yeah, I mean, do you feel like, from your perspective, Rial's character, has she lied to herself about what's happened? Like, is she confused? Like, I suppose that's an interesting one as well. Have the two of them almost changed their own narrative of what happened in order to protect themselves? When she asks about, yeah, it's not like she knows the whole time that she doesn't have a daughter. What's your perspective on that, or am I making it?
yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a trauma response, in many ways.
Yeah.
But like, there's this scene where she's at the doctor's office as part of that
Mm.
council, getting lost in the council estate
Yes.
uh, sequence, and which I just love with the doctor, and the doctor's all trying to be like, oh, do you have a daughter? So do I, and
Yeah,
Rial's
yeah.
like,
You
total
can't kill her.
just like, no, no. She's like, yeah, we lost her, and so in that moment it's just, you're just like, wow, what you it feels to me incredibly realistic, or just like grounded in reality. um I don't know. No, I think that that she felt a lot of responsibility for this child, and I don't think she was deluding herself into thinking, oh, this is my daughter, but it's like, she says, one of the only lines of dialogue that we see from that time is she's saying to the little girl, I'll protect you,
Mm.
and then she doesn't. And I think that, as this is all stuff at the very end, is kind of like the response to, but the whole film leading up to that, in terms of the marriage and the relationship between the two of them, I mean, that also is about their inability to accept what actually happened, and to be able to kind of talk about it in the same way. So, I see, and this is something Remy and I talked about, is that he really wanted to express kind of the different ways that they were experiencing this. And it's, I just, that's one of my favorite parts of the film, is just like they're, see, because you see them in the beginning, it's very sweet, and they're a unit, and they're, very much in this experience together. You see them sort of pull apart, and
Mm.
then, it does, there is that aspect at the very end. I mean, she saves his life,
Mhm.
by deciding that that is what her, she needs to be there, to be in her present reality, with, that's where her home is. So a lot of this stuff talking about where's my home, and even the gory, like the effect of the
Mhm.
creature kind of like putting his, that's so sick, but it's like, he's literally taking over his body in a way,
Mhm.
and
And that's
so,
what guilt does, doesn't it? It overtake, everything that he experienced is visually, that's exactly how it, how it would feel like, I guess.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's, that's kind of it's very metaphorical, and
Mhm.
but it's also a literal creature, like devouring this human being. So you have like body horror, you have haunted house, you have, monsters, you have all of these trappings of a classic horror film, but then you're also telling this story on a deeper level. um so yeah. I don't know. I just saw The Witch again recently, which I hadn't seen in
Mm.
ages. I saw it, well, ages. I saw it when it came out. And then there was a screening here in New York recently, with the editor Lou Ford, who did a Q&A afterwards, which was very
Mm.
cool. And, just as an aside, I mean, which
Yeah.
I love that film, but I really was struck this time on seeing it a second time and several years later. I was like, yes, it's still very scary. I mean, I was terrified the first time I saw it. The second time, it was still very tense, but I was really struck by how sad that film is. Like, it's just sort of heartbreaking, what happens to these people and the context of, like, this early country. I don't know, not to get into that whole tangent, but I was thinking about when I just saw it, because I mean, I think there is a type of, not to say anyone is any better than any other, but I think me personally, I gravitate more towards that idea of you're really trying to tell some deeper, bigger story, and then the horror is um, organic to those themes and to those characters, and kind of provides this, like, allows you to explore some more taboo things, and allows you to kind of um, yeah, it's just a very particular lens. I mean, I am far from an expert on horror, so I really am reluctant to give any, like, to say anything about it other than what just my own experience is cutting it. Because I think that when you're editing, it is very specific. Like, you're really trying to achieve a very specific thing, and a lot of it comes down to tone, and a lot of it comes down to, it is pacing, and it is, um, you know, effects and all of that stuff. But, like, I'm always going to come back to what is the story that we're trying to tell, and how can we get those story ideas across as elegantly as possible, and not try to shove it down anyone's face and, like, have all this exposition and, like, it's, I mean, sometimes it's
Mhm.
inevitable, but anyway.
Well, there's a simplicity in both his house and the witch, that they don't do anything more than they need to in order to tell, yes, this very sad story. And the horror element allows for, like you've just said about the monster going in, like, under his skin and stuff. Like, how else do you? It's almost like every film needs these elements where you can go, okay, this is how these feelings, actually look, rather than doing it in a drama way. That's why I'm always drawn to horror more, because it just, like you said, it goes for taboos. It opens conversations around things that you normally wouldn't. And I think that it's really special and completely underrated, for those reasons. Thank you so much. I'd really love to kind of end by just getting a bit of a sense of your sort of career as an editor. And I know this could be a whole other big conversation, but what drew you to this as a career path? Like, when did you first know you wanted to become an editor?
Well, I will try to keep this brief because it's a very long and winding road in terms of, like, I never really set my sights on filmmaking at all. I studied comparative literature in university, and I like films, but I was more of a book person, I guess. And it certainly never occurred to me that it was like a job that you could have, or that it was any sort of. I just didn't think of it that way. So I tried lots of different things before I got around to the idea of film at all. And I first actually, when I went to film school, I went to a small school in Denmark, not the National Danish Film School, but there's a small international school called the European Film College, which is kind of, it's not super well known, but a friend of mine told me about it. And at that point, I had, like, a master's degree in comparative literature, and I had done, like, three or four different, jobs in the arts, but it wasn't blah, blah, blah. So I was, looking for something that was going to be creative, but, I also didn't feel very comfortable putting myself front and center as, like, an
Mhm.
artist, or, a writer or anything. But I wanted to be involved in I still was interested in storytelling from the whole, all the literature stuff. Um, anyway, I signed up for this program, which was really kind of simple. It was like a foundational course. So you didn't have to have a focus necessarily. It's just 1 year, but everybody got to do everything. So there'd be like 3 weeks of directing, 3 weeks of sound, 3 weeks of editing, or, these modules like that. And I actually went in thinking for sure I was going to be a cinematographer because I had like just been beating my head around like words and texts and narrative. I'd done all this literary theory and it was like so cerebral, and I needed a way to like become more in touch with my emotions or something, blah, blah, blah. So
I
I
love.
was convinced, no, that's another conversation, but I was convinced that I should go into imagery, like I should like move away from language or something, as if these things are separate, which they are not. But at that time, I was like, cool, I'm going to be a cinematographer. And, I did the cinematography module and I was just like dismayed by how I couldn't make the images like they are in my head and all these buttons on the camera. And like that was like not an interface that was really working for me. And then I just, next in line was editing. Like literally, I didn't even think about what editing was until I was sitting in front of an Avid in this classroom, basically in like the middle of a field in Denmark. And it was pretty immediate because it is like writing, and it's a synthesis of everything. You're bringing in music and sound, and obviously you're working with picture, but also, it's obvious. But at the time, it was kind of revelatory for me because I thought, oh, like I don't have to choose. If I do editing, I get to have a little bit of it all. So it was pretty immediate. Like honestly, the rest of that program, I just tried to edit as many short films from the other students as possible, and then through a very lucky connection with a friend of mine, I got a job at Zentropa as an assistant editor, like in house. So I worked there for about a year and a half, um, just full time assistant editing, like everything that came through Zentropa. So feature films, commercials, documentaries. And I really learned on the job that way.
That's awesome. I think that yeah, it's a story that lots of people will recognize. I know. Do you know the editor Elizabeth Ronaldsdotter?
Yes.
She
I mean, I don't know her
cut
personally, but yeah.
bullet train. And her story. She also one, thought I'm going to be a cinematographer. Like this is I'm going to do that bit, and
Yeah.
then she always says it wasn't conducive to because she has 4 kids, so she was like I couldn't do I think 4, 5. I don't know. Sorry, Elizabeth. But she was like editing suited that better rather than always being on set. Um, so if we could please end with any advice you have for anyone. I want to keep it broad, not necessarily women specific, but someone who wants to start a career as an editor, what piece of advice would you have told yourself when you were starting out?
Well, I mean, one big difference than when I was starting out, I think, is just like the technology is so much more accessible.
Mhm.
Like, you can have a software only version of Avid. That didn't exist when I started. We had like these, I worked in a machine room where we were like using patching like beta cam, all it was like different world. So, I think that there is a lot you can just kind of do on your own. I don't know. I mean, I started as an assistant editor and I learned so much that way, from
Mhm.
working with a lot of different editors and just learning how a cutting room is run. So I still would recommend that at least a little bit of time as an AE is really valuable, and finding an editor that you can maybe develop a relationship with and get more experience that way. But I think it just kind of comes down to cutting, because you have to, it's a different, an AE and an editor, it is a different job. And when you get the opportunity to step into that role, I think one thing that a lot of people that stops people, even AEs who are quite experienced, when they come to that moment. I've seen a lot of people, you have a lack of confidence, or they're like, oh no, I don't know that which imposter syndrome, like we all get that, and it's so understandable. But I think that, just trying to cut short films on the side, or anything you can do just to start developing a sense of decision making, and like what is your eye, all of that. And I think just like watching films also. I mean, watching films, talking about films, breaking them down, like what works, what doesn't work. And on a practical level, I mean, networking, I think is a part of it. I don't know, what it's like in other places really, but in New York there are several organizations. We have unions, we have, different post-production, official and less official kind of get-togethers. I have, other editors I will get drinks with regularly, and we talk about, so it does, I think. I don't know how you start that necessarily. Go, maybe just like looking for, I mean, I can name some organizations here, like the Blue Collar Post Collective is a really good place to look.
Mhm.
Um, in New York, we have the Post New York Alliance. So I'm sure I didn't really get, when I was in
I can
London,
always put some I can put some links underneath as well, because yeah, there's lots of different places for people to go to just start networking and meeting people, finding those opportunities. They don't happen if you're not meeting people in that way. Is a really it's like a hard part sometimes, because the word networking, the whole concept is like for a lot of people. I know that I used to find it really hard, but it's you can't deny that it's important. And also it's like it's a support network. And I think, you know, to be massively generalized about it, like editors are great. Then you kind of, you want to surround yourself with people you can talk about things that
yeah,
you're passionate.
yeah, definitely. And I think things like, I mean, film festivals too, right? Like not everyone's going to go to Sundance, for example, but festivals like, Berlin, Toronto, those are just in the middle of the city, and they have public screenings, even New York Film Festival, to try to, like, are there panels? Are there places where people are hanging out? I mean, just as a way to kind of be where in these spaces where other filmmakers are. Um, so I think that the social aspect of it, and then and just like, but always for the creative stuff, I think, um, trying to just cut whatever you can, um, and watch a lot of movies, and talk to people, and watch edit girls interviews, and all of that stuff. It's informative. I mean, there's so many podcasts. I am not really a podcast person necessarily, but there is, I mean, in terms of what I listen to, because I just get overwhelmed with how much there is. But there are so many resources out there, and I think when I do, listen to them, I get, or like Matt's, the Rough Cut, and there's other podcasts, and then going through like some of the older interviews you've done, they're so informative. So I do think those, and all of that, there's just resources that are out there. So I think educating, and of course there's books, and read and everyone should read it in the blink of an eye, and the conversations. Yeah, that's.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed this, and again, love the film, goes without saying. And is there anything in terms of like what you're up to next that you want to share or can share, or?
I wish I could. I'm looking for a job, so if you have any leads.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. What's next on the horizon? Yeah, no, that's cool. I guess the life of an editor is always waiting for, or not necessarily waiting, like going after that next project.
Yeah,
So,
I'm reading some
what?
scripts right now because, yeah, we're sort of in that cycle where like the next round of films are
Mm,
gonna start in March, kind of. So I am reading scripts, but that will be, yeah, I can tell you that it probably won't be a horror film, but we never know.
yeah. Great. Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.